Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file. Coming up next in our discussion, Russian troops have left Snake Island in the Black Sea after they carried out what they said was a successful operation. Despite Russian threat of any interference, the U.S. Defense Department is reviewing 1,300 proposals from 800 companies for innovative and new weapons and commercial capabilities they may be able to develop and produce for Ukraine to use in its fights against Russia's invasion. Sweden and Finland are set formally to end decades of neutrality and join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in a historic breakthrough for the alliance that deals a blow to Russian President Vladimir Putin. All this will be discussed with our panel of guests after this break. So to talk about these developments, I am joined live via Skype by Michel Zubenica, a political analyst and a PR advisor from Serbia, along with Justin D. Cook, an associate professor of international relations from France. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. And before we delve into any discussion, let's just share the latest updates. Ukrainian officials said on Friday that at least 18 people have been killed after 2 Russian missiles struck a multi-story apartment building in the southern port city of Odessa. Other 41 people had been rescued. Local reports said 3 people, including a child, were killed in another separate attack on the creation or recreation center, with 1 injured. So let's begin with you, Mr. Justin D. Cook. How do we interpret these escalations from the Russian side amid what is the NATO doing at the summit, implementing new measures to counter Russia?
Well, these indiscriminate targeting of civilians is nothing new. I'm not going to paint a rosy picture of the Ukrainian war. Everyone's got blood on their hands. But I think this is just kind of the way the Russians wage war. They try to grind you down. They're going to try to exhaust you. And it's happened on many occasions. The 2 wars in Chechnya, the war waged, it's still waging in Syria. It qualified everyone as a terrorist, which gave it kind of carte blanche to target who it wanted. And in the Ukrainian situation, obviously the intentions here are to denazify the country. So I think it gives them the liberty under this guise to target whoever they would like. I'm not so sure how much it changes anything on the battlefield. Maybe it distracts attention. Maybe from time to time they do hit an arms depot. But the damages and the loss of human life in this war are really significant, notably on the civilian side.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Mr. Michel Zubenica? How do you interpret the latest assaults from the Russian side? And how do you see what is NATO showing, as a unified front? Is it really unified, or especially after we see those kind of childish bickering and insults from the Western leaders, and we have Putin responding as well when they made fun of him? How is this like a desperate sign to see that there is no negotiation coming anytime soon to solve the problem diplomatically, that is?
First of all, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be in your TV show.
Pleasure is ours. Thank you for joining us.
It's a very horrible scene. Unfortunately, Ukrainian citizens are the biggest loser and victims of this situation, and this war. Russia made some criminal stuff, and before we can talking about Bursha and some civilian victims of Ukraine is there. But your question about NATO answers it's a very important issue because it was one of the primary reasons for Russia to start the war in Ukraine. Ukraine membership in NATO was one of the arguments for Putin to start the invasion, but I think that he has a very wrong strategy because we have in next period two new country will be a member of NATO, Finland and Sweden, and it will be a very difficult to Putin to explain to international community why he will not attack, for example, Finland, who is also in the border on Russia. One of the it will also be very difficult to explain, and his own citizens. And I think it will be a very huge news for strategic security concept in that part of Europe. But unfortunately, it will be a new instability in that part of Europe, and Russia. Unfortunately, it will be some new radical attack. Almost, of course, in Ukraine, but it will be very interesting to see how will Russia will have relations in next period with Finland and then Sweden, because Finland have a 1,000 kilometer border with Russia.
Mm-hmm. And what about you, Mr. Justin Teak? Can you comment on what steps or the necessary steps the Ukrainian government is taking to verify the alleged attacks against its border stations and border management software, given the implications of the conflict on migration in general?
Well, I think this is an interesting point that was also pointed out during during the most recent Madrid summit, where they just passed their new strategic concept. It set forth a number of define the new security environment, and obviously there is kind of a gap between what's happening in Ukraine and what the new security environment is. There wasn't any pledge to physically send troops to Ukraine in this sense, but it did signify a fundamental shift in deterrence and defense. As the United States is now going to be sending 100,000 forces to Europe, NATO is going to strengthen its forward defense in Eastern Europe, and it's going to put 300,000 troops on high readiness. It's also, obviously, as our guest just mentioned, going to invite Sweden and Finland to join the alliance, and it's also pledged long-term support. There's a lot to come from the United States, from Europe, and from NATO within this war to ensure that the Ukrainians have what they need to maintain their defense and their capabilities to defend themselves.
And speaking of NATO leaders have met during this week's summit in Madrid, where they have taken a new strategic concept which defines Russia as the most significant and direct threat to allies' security and to peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area. During the summit, the conflict in Ukraine dominated the talks and led the alliance to take several decisions on the matter. Let's follow the report and we get back.
The security reinforcement outside showed that what would happen inside this building was tremendously important. For 3 days, more than 40 NATO leaders met in Madrid for a summit in a unique context and with multiple files on the table. The summit paved the way for Finland and Sweden to join NATO after Turkey made a U-turn and finally agreed to lift its veto, and in a weeks-long dispute that tested the unity of the alliance during the conflict in Ukraine. The Russian President Vladimir Putin sees this as imperial ambitions for NATO. He accused the military alliance of seeking to assert its supremacy through the Ukraine conflict.
In regard to Finland and Sweden, we don't have problems with Finland and Sweden that unfortunately we have with Ukraine. We have no territorial disputes with them. There is nothing that might concern us in terms of Finland and Sweden becoming NATO members. If they want to, please go ahead. But they should clearly understand that they didn't face any threats before this.
Они должны ясно и четко себе представлять, что раньше не было никаких угроз для них.
The alliance will not only become larger, but will also adopt a new strategy that sees Russia as the greatest threat and no longer as a possible partner. However, this will have far-reaching consequences and will change the image in Europe. From Madrid, US President Joe Biden announced that the United States would strengthen its military positioning in Europe so that NATO could respond to threats from all directions. The meeting was also a chance for US President to blame Russia again for the soaring prices of energy and food around the world.
The reason why gas prices are up is because of Russia. Russia. The reason why the food crisis exists is because of Russia.
At the time of NATO meeting, Ukraine knew several bombardments and shelling in what was a clear message from Moscow that it would respond if the West continues to assist Ukraine militarily. Russia announced it has willingly withdrawn from Snake Island, but there in Madrid, the alliance saw this as a victory for Ukraine.
Because I think that they do have the potential to turn this round. We've seen what Ukraine can do to drive the Russians back. We've seen what they did around Kiev, around Kharkiv, now on Snake Island. I think the right thing for us is to keep going on the course that NATO has set out, no matter how difficult it may be.
NATO's new roadmap not only directed its harshest language towards Russia, but also considered China as a security challenge for the first time. However, Beijing says NATO's first new strategy concept in a decade disregards facts and wrongly defines the country's intentions.
So back to you, Mr. Michel Zobenika. How do we expect a Russian response here? What kind of response is it expected, seeing that Sweden and Finland are going to join NATO now?
I don't know. Maybe Russia can only to take control under some others area in Ukraine and maybe in some other countries like Moldova. That is only things that Russia can do. Russia cannot attack Finland, as I said, because and we have some historical experience before Second World War and Russian-Finland's war, and Russia lose that war and etc. But I think the very important question is what will NATO and Western country will do in next period. I see that EU unfortunately is very divided on the question how relations with Russia will be in next period. For example, my opinion is that geopolitical situation at this moment is that we have United States in one side, and United States will take that situation to take under the control. I think a good part of the Europe, especially western and central part of Europe. But on the other side, Russia will go to the Asia, and we will have in next period two blocks of the country: Western with American leads and Eastern with China's leads. Because the biggest loser of this situation is Europe and Russia, and the biggest winners maybe is China and the United States. But the problem is also that, for example, in Europe you have eastern countries like Poland, like Ukraine, like Baltic states. They are very anti-Russian attitude, but some Western countries like Italy, like Germany, have very special relations with Russia. And this moment, you have Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who has still in this time a very good relations with regime in Russia. I think that EU need to have much more unity attitude about relations with Russia, and it will be one of the key stuff in the next period. How will the situation in Europe will be for international community.
Back to you, Mr. Justin Decook. How do you see the war altering the thinking behind NATO's upcoming strategic concept, that is?
Well, the strategic concept, which is in a sense kind of a blueprint or an official document that stipulates the enduring principles of the alliance and sets out the security tasks for the present and for the future. So for the first time in four strategic concepts since the end of the Cold War, as our panelists just mentioned, Russia is designated as an enemy, whereas in the past it was designated as a partner or a potential partner for cooperation. So this changes a lot in terms of their approach, in terms of NATO's military posture, the United States' military posture, this immediate pivot to Europe, but also the strategic concept for the first time, as mentioned, identifies China as an important player and one that needs to be contended with. And so both of these countries have been kind of put in the package of one where the return of interstate war is more important than it has been in recent contemporary history. And also, they both represent authoritarian regimes, which was specifically mentioned in the strategic concept here, as these authoritarian institutions and countries represent a direct challenge to the development of democracy due to their cyber attacks, their interventions within the democratic institutions and democratic elections. But what is interesting about the strategic concept is that it leaves an overture for engagement with China. It does not close the door with China as it has done with Russia due to the war. It mentions on how important the role of arms control will be in the future, as arms control and the European security architecture has been eroded. Not just with the war, this was something that is happening over the course of the last 20 years. With the end of the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the INF treaty, open skies, all these important arms control treaties that created a stable peace in Europe had dissipated. And so I think that's a path towards engagement with China on the arms control issue. But the second issue with China, from an American perspective, would be that of economic and trade relations. So there's been some high-level talks recently, backdoor talks with China, about reducing tariffs, about opening up trade relations with China. So I think it may be heading towards a positive development in regard to what happened during the Trump administration and their aggressive economic approach towards China. China has, for the moment, stayed away from Taiwan. So that's kind of a positive development, I think, in the near-term future.
And what about the suggestion of Spain about the presence of NATO, perhaps forces or alliance with some African countries, that is to guarantee certain stability there? Do you think that perhaps NATO could go there? Mr. Justin Decook?
Well, we are a long way from that moment here. That's not something that was specifically mentioned in the strategic concept. I think it's just kind of an illusion. Finland and Sweden are the perfect candidates right now regarding NATO's open door policy in Article 10, which allows for any sovereign state that wishes to become a member can have the right to do so. But you have to understand it is a multi-stage process. There are a number of requirements: functioning democracy in a political system based on a market economy, the respect of human rights and minority populations, commitment to peace. You have to have the financial resources to make financial contributions to NATO, which has been a constant and historical struggle. And you have to have a commitment also to democratic civilian-military relations and the institutional structure. So it's not a given for anyone else but Finland and Sweden. Now, Finland and Sweden get, in a sense, to skip the line over that 6 or 7 stage process due to the critical nature of the geopolitical and security context in Europe. And what is astonishing is that the Finns and the Swedes gave up their neutrality, whereas just last year they declared that they weren't going to be a NATO candidate. So one of the major benefits I think it's important for NATO regarding these two countries is that militarily speaking, Sweden and Finland are capable countries and they have military capacity. The Swedes produce fabulous fighters. They have great tanks. They produce excellent weapons. The Finns, they're NATO compatible with NATO standards regarding equipment, and they have the capability to mobilize. So they are perfect candidates right now. Beyond them, it's a whole other story if we're going to talk about Africa. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Very nice indeed. U.S. President Joe Biden on Thursday said Washington will announce $800 million of additional weapons aid to Ukraine in the coming days. Biden disclosed the plans during a news conference following a NATO summit in Madrid, where he declared the alliance is united in response to Russia's special military operation in Ukraine.
And again, the United States is leading the way. We provided Ukraine with nearly $7 billion in security assistance since I took office. The next few days, we intend to announce more than $800 million more, including new advanced Western air defense systems for Ukraine, more artillery and ammunition, counter battery radars, additional ammunition for the HIMARS multiple launch rocket systems we've already given Ukraine, and more HIMARS coming from other countries as well.
So, Mr. Michel Zubenica, the defensive weapons coming from the U.S., do you think is doing enough to stop the Russians' advancement, or is it inevitable that Ukraine will have to go on the offense to stop Russia?
Obviously, Ukraine needs much more help from the Western allies. And I'm not a military expert, but I saw that in the beginning of the war, the Ukraine has a very strong resistance in the war with Russian army. But in previous probably 1 month or a couple of weeks, Russian is in offensive, and Russia has good results on the ground. And that is very problem for Ukraine forces. They need more material, more logistical, more intelligence help, and it will be very hard for Ukraine to be on this position, especially in Donbas. Donbas is the key of the result of the war. Obviously, that Russia is interesting for eastern part of Ukraine. They changed their military strategy and goals of this war. In the beginning, Russia wants to have under the control whole territory of Ukraine, including the Kyiv. But in this moment, I think that Russia will be satisfied with eastern part of Ukraine to have territorial unity, Crimea and Donbas, and in next period to take this territory and to import in our territory of Russian Federation. I think that is the goal of the Russian Federation, and it will be very, like I said, for Ukraine forces to defend that territory, especially Donbas, because the Russian army is much more stronger than Ukraine in this moment.
Speaking of that, Mr. Michel Zubenica, why do you think the West hasn't supplied Ukraine with the vehicle-mounted anti-aircraft missiles capable of reaching all of Russia's high-flying planes? I mean, aren't they supposed to help Ukraine win and not just hold off the Russians? Without allies in Russia, I mean, how is the U.S. able to predict Russia's next move?
I think some political circle on the West are afraid of a Russian response and the reaction about military helping of Ukraine forces. Vladimir Putin said in the first day of invasion that Russian will not be a tolerant country about the question of the third country to be in this war. And because of that, Western countries are very afraid to be more including in this war, especially on military field, and because of that, everybody knows that Ukraine's like a nation, like state, must to be unified, and it's all about Ukraine. How will be a result of the war? Western can help with some money, with some financial and material stuff, but on the ground, it will be soldiers who will be the key of the end of the war. How will be that the end?
Mm-hmm. Mr. Justin D. Cook, can you tell us, according to you, how is Russia going to be engaged in this war, let's say further in the future? Do you think it is preparing for a long war? And how do these, let's say, substantial amounts of aid provided to Ukraine actually affect domestically the U.S.?
Well, I think one major lesson that we all have learned is that analysts and decision makers have to remain extremely open-minded regarding the possible range of outcomes. Now, the range of outcomes of today are just as present as they were during February 24th, the start of the invasion. Now, the odds of certain outcomes have changed, but 4 months into the war, Russia still hasn't seized the territory of Donbass. It's created its land bridge, but it's lost a third of its ground troops doing that. Now, it hasn't achieved, of course, the original goal of denazifying the country, demilitarizing, and regime change. So I think when it comes to outcome, when it comes to the near and distant future, a lot of it depends on Russia. Let's entertain that idea. So if Russia controls the Donbass, will it stop there? Will we have a frozen conflict similar to that in Moldova or into Georgia with Abkhazia, Ossetia, Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan, two of which have known the return of war? So a frozen conflict will not be a satisfying solution to either the Russians, I think, or the Ukrainians, or even NATO. Now, if the Russians continue into mainland Ukraine, which is an extremely large country, will they have enough troops to do it? Will they have enough equipment? They fired over 2,000 missiles. Their Air Force has proven incapable. They're flying scared. They're unable to conduct an amphibious assault. So will they overstretch themselves if they continue to venture into Ukrainian territory? So Russia today is not capable of leading a major new offensive without the general mobilization of its country. And this doesn't seem very likely because, number one, it would be an admission of failure on Putin's behalf. And number two, regarding their last military doctrine, they took that out, the whole notion of military mobilization since the first time since the Napoleonic Wars. So it's going to depend on the Russians. Now, on the Ukrainian perspective, it's really when is the breaking point? For how long can the Ukrainians maintain the defense of their positions? Because it does not appear that they are capable of leading an offensive or that they have the capability to drive the Russians out of Donbass right now.
But leading the defensive depends mainly on the Western aid. And here I paraphrase my question again, Mr. Justin D. Cook, about the substantial amount of aid that is reaching Ukraine from the U.S. How does this actually affect the domestic front in the U.S.? And is still the U.S. doing the heavy lifting when it comes to keeping balance from aid from all the Western parts here?
Well, it's been an important aspect, obviously, for the military-industrial complex in the United States. It's given the United States, obviously, another opportunity, to help out, people that are maybe close to the administration. In essence, I don't think it's a very positive development for the United States to keep going down this route from a domestic position. Internationally, it's going to be very beneficial for the country as it continues to, create influence and space within Europe and have European and NATO countries more dependent on American weaponry. Now, in retrospect, it's beneficial for NATO countries because they get to dispose of their Soviet-era equipment. They're sending that to Ukraine, and they're going to be re-equipped by the United States. So there are some advantages for both countries And it's an unfortunate situation, of course, because we have to do this within a war in Europe.
Michel Zubenija, what's your sense right now about where Putin's political and then under him military objectives are right now and how they evolved over the last 100 days or so?
It's a difficult question because I think in the long term Russia is in historical decrease. This war and situation in Russia, it will be very difficult, especially for Russian citizens, not for Russian authorities. For example, these sanctions will not affect Vladimir Putin, his fellows, businessmen, but Russian citizens will have a very hard standard in next period. We know that in this moment a very large number of Russian citizens left Russian Federation. For example, I'm from Serbia, and a large number of Russian citizens come here to live because they don't want to live in a country like Russia, where everything is under control of regime in Moscow and etc. It is very good question. How will because the Vladimir Putin is in the power for 20 years, how will Russia will look after him? Because we have information that he's maybe have some disease and other stuff. And one of
Mr. Michel Zubenica, I'm sorry to cut your train of thought. We have reached the end of our show. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis, and thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. It's the end. Bye for now.